Hello and welcome to another episode of Market Watch. Today I have a very special guest with me who is Professor Pratap Banu Mehta. Professor Mehta is a leading political scientist and a public intellectual from India. He leads the Center for Policy Research, one of India's top think tanks. Professor Mehta, thank you very much for joining us. Professor Mehta, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to get right to the questions in terms of what I wanted to ask you and see what your views on the current status quo of the FTAs or the free trade agreements between India and Sri Lanka, and in terms of your view, how you see that coming along.
So look, one of the things of great regret in South Asia, in Indian Ocean region more generally, is we usually proceed with decision making much slower than we should, and it gets involved in complicated politics in both our countries, right? The long and short of it is that the world trading order is going to undergo a major revolution in the next few years. I think the victory of Donald Trump is signaling that, and the only name of the game in town is going to be actually bilateral trade agreements. It's very unlikely you're going to get multilateral trading agreements at a global level, right? And a closer integration of Asia more generally, not just India and Sri Lanka. I mean, India and Sri Lanka are a kind of critical pivot in that, is generally a very desirable thing, right? I think it's for both our countries to ask the question, if it is being held up, why is it being held up? Is it being held up because there's an underlying economic logic? And sometimes there are technical issues involved. Or is it being held up because, both our countries sort of give undue credence to constituencies of fear rather than constituencies of hope within our countries, right? I mean, you can enlighten me more on that, but my sense is that it has been held hostage far too long, I think, to politics than to economic rationality.
Definitely, Professor Mehta. I, as a field, in terms of the the re-election campaigns, etc. I mean, they are actually holding, the growth in ransom for the political views that they're having. But I think what's happening at the moment, in my opinion, is like they are going to have a big discussion. And I think all the fine lines have to be discussed as well, especially between India. I think because in the past, Sri Lanka wasn't ready for such agreements. So now I think it's kind. But I'd like to know, in terms of India, does India find Sri Lanka to be one of their greatest partners? Because I was going to get to this question later. Because however, the Sri Lanka has a lot more ties with China at the moment. And how does India view that in India's perspective?
So two responses. Look, Sri Lanka is terribly important to India. I mean, and as you know, the creation of economic ties is endogenous to the kinds of agreements you have, right? For example, a greater integration of our outsourcing industries would be hugely beneficial to Sri Lanka, right? I also agree. I think it's perfectly understandable that because of its size, India does generate anxieties in our smaller neighbors. I mean, it's just an existential fact. And I think India recognizes it, and I don't think should insist on kind of complete reciprocity in everything. I think that policy changed a long time ago. So in that sense, there's a lot more room for, I think, assuaging Sri Lanka's anxieties and so forth. Although, as I suspect, I suspect the economic obstacles to this agreement are smaller than the psychological and political ones. Coming to the China question, right? Look, I think in India views are divided on this. There's certainly parts of the security establishment that tend to view Chinese presence in the region more generally, not just with a great degree of suspicion, but a great degree of alarm, right? My own view, for whatever it's worth, it's not an official view, is that you have to be very nuanced about this discussion. I actually, to be honest, don't think there is a problem Chinese building infrastructure, so long as there's not a big political quid pro quo for it. I think one of the things small countries have to think about is what are the terms in which the Chinese are building the infrastructure. Is it a short-term game, but does it lead to long-term structures of indebtedness, right? But my own view of the India-Sri Lanka story in this is that, look, at the end of the day, right, it's very hard to beat the imperatives of geography, right? Even if the Chinese build infrastructure in Sri Lanka to make it commercially viable, India can be a good partner, right? I mean, ports work only if everybody uses them, right? And to that extent, I don't think things like investment in infrastructure and so forth should worry. I think what worries people is when investment in infrastructure and with the economic relationship comes with a form of political dependence, right? Where, you see countries wading into larger sort of disputes. I think that worries. But I think with India and Sri Lanka, there should be enough candor to be able to actually manage those differences of judgment. And I do think politicians in all our countries, I mean, it's not specifically true of Sri Lanka, even sometimes try to be a little bit too clever by half. You can play different constituencies of each other, and what we lose sight of is what is good for the peoples of our country. I mean, I don't think we should let our security fears in a sense dominate and trump kind of all of these discussions about economics and welfare.
No, certainly, Professor Mehta, I understand. I mean, I think some of the historical in terms of decisions that India took are still wearing around some of the Sri Lankan minds. Yeah. But I think, we've gone past that long after that. I think the political environment has changed, the geopolitical environment has changed. So I think, personally, I also don't feel, I really agree with you in terms of that, that fear shouldn't be there anymore. I mean, am I right to assume that?
So that, and the other thing we forget, right, which is both our countries are young countries. And I think there's a time lag between the structure of our decision makers and what our young people want, right? I mean, the young people want to talk about artificial intelligence, technology collaborations, outsourcing, interface, all of those opportunities, right? You're going to be able to leverage your economic power only if you're thickly networked into the growing dynamic regions of the world. That's what young people want to talk about, right? Our politicians are sort of, still playing out the games of the 1970s, 1980s. It's a big problem for Asia. I mean, I often say that our historical imaginations run about 30 years behind what our economic imperatives are.
Definitely. Rightly put, Professor Mehta. I think I got a little bit ahead of myself as well, talking about locally. I think it was very imperative. But again, with the FTAs coming back to the free trade agreements, Professor, the US leaving TPP, such measures, and President Trump really pushing for protectionism. How do you think this will affect the region overall, South Asia, in your opinion?
So look, it's going to have profound impacts, right? Both India and Sri Lanka for the last 25, 30 years had assumed that the world was in a phase of globalization, right? Not just in terms of, more open trade, but also let's not forget we have large migrant worker populations, right? Both of our countries, right? And the one thing is very clear that the two central premises of globalization, right, which is more open trade and somewhat more labor mobility, both of those are going to be reversed, even if marginally, right? That trend is out, right? Second, I think we have to understand this is really the most important challenge for both our countries is the employment elasticity of capital is falling, right? It just takes a lot more capital to generate jobs, right? I gather Sri Lanka is doing interesting things in artificial intelligence, the high tech. But the question of how many jobs that's going to generate still remains, in a sense, an open one. So we are at that pivotal moment where, which comes once in a generation, where the fundamental economic architecture that the world is going to face is up for grabs again. And I do not see a way of dealing with that challenge which actually does not involve greater integration within Asia, broadly speaking. In fact, this could be an opportunity for us. I mean, an opportunity for us not just in terms of kind of taking a lead in creating open societies and open economies, right? I mean, in a sense, India, Sri Lanka together can be exemplars of a new free world, right? I mean, that's a space waiting to be occupied. right? But it also, I think, now forces us to say we cannot take the easy way out. We'll send workers abroad, remittances will come in. All of these days are numbered.
Yes, definitely, Professor. I see that, and I think like getting back onto our previous topic, I think this is a very timely thing where we really need the FTAs between Sri Lanka and India, because I'm looking from a Sri Lankan perspective. We're looking at over 1 billion population, and if we can supply to that, I mean, taking it from a very simple perspective there. So I think there's a lot more we can do. Professor, on the same lines, like I know that, like we spoke before, China has been pretty involved. They talk about the Silk Route, involving Sri Lanka within that Silk Route in terms of the development and their trading routes, etc. Do you see any of those plans coming out of India involving Colombo or Sri Lanka as a whole to integrate into this growth story? Do you see any of that popping off from India?
So look, there are a couple of things, right? One, of course, there are particular infrastructure projects. I think I gather recently there's a discussion around Trincomalee Port, right? And kind of integrating Sri Lanka more into the Bay of Bengal sort of region, right? Those kinds of projects make a lot of sense. But I think the important thing to remember, right, about the difference between China and India in vis-a-vis Sri Lanka is, in India, whatever relationships that happen with Sri Lanka will have to emerge organically, right? They will have to involve the private sector. They will have to involve organic links between the people. In China's outward orientation, right, it's really kind of state-driven, right? Now, state-driven has the advantage that in the short run, it looks very purposive. It's certainly quite efficient in some ways. I mean, you can't dispute China's record on the delivery of infrastructure. It's understandable people are attracted by it, right? The question is, though, whether that model of integration is actually sustainable. As I said, look, at the end of the day, you can build all the infrastructure you want. In fact, a lot of infrastructure is probably being driven by this strategic competition, rather than asking the question, does the underlying economic logic actually make sense? I mean, will we end up with a glut of port capacity, for example, right? Yeah. That should be the core question, right? Not, if India has built one, China should build one. If China has built one, India should, build one, right? Because it's locking in sort of investments. Yeah. So the one advantage, and I think I feel a little sad, not just Sri Lanka, but for historically Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, India, all of us, right? We are trying to run away from our own geography and those organic links that actually make these relationships sustainable, right? We are trying to sort of abridge them in the name of, oh, this infrastructure is coming, that infrastructure is coming. So the the relationship with India will seem less purposive, right? But it's like weaving a complicated tapestry. It will have so many strands to it, and we should just facilitate those organic strands to, emerge, rather than think largely of, these big, mega, symbolic kind of statements.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Professor, also want to touch on to your, again, I think, onto the socio-economic development and, touching on the constitution, I beg your pardon. Now, Sri Lanka is going for a new constitution. What are your thoughts and what your advice would be in terms of, gender mainstreaming? I'm not just talking about inclusion of women having a 50-50, those are not, but in terms of the women, and then what about the, disability rights, etc. Not only the mainstream accessibility or having this thing, but in terms of a policy level, should it be a national policy, or do you think it should be like an individual organizational culture that should be coming in? What's your thought on this, Professor?
So there are a couple of things about it, right? So the one thing we do know that in the long run, those economies do better and will do well that can bring women's participation into the workforce on equal terms than men, right? I mean, that is some of your most prized human capital asset, right? And India has done, for example, an abominable job on that. It's doing much better in higher education now, but our female workplace participation rates are actually falling, right? And for a variety of reasons. I mean, partly people are staying in school and college longer, but partly, safety issues, structure of your cities, cultural norms, all those things matter, right? So the way to think about gender is not as this is a social issue we need to tack on to everything else. This is actually a fundamental architectural choice you're making in designing your economy, right? Particularly equal pay for equal work. I mean, that has to be a basic non-discriminatory norm. I think a work environment, right, that is gender sensitive in all kinds of ways, right? And in some ways, I mean, even at the risk of offending my friends in India, if you look at the India-China contrast and say, where did India fall behind? It's not infrastructure, it's not all of that. I mean, that's a symptom more than a cause. It's the fact that India was not able to facilitate gender empowerment and equal participation as well, right? Now, if you think of it this way, then there's a whole range of things that need to be done. Then it's not just a question of saying, we'll allocate a little bit more money for one project to project, right? How do you change the culture of your factories? How do you change the culture of your cities, right? Sometimes, sensitive norms involving family relationships, right? I mean, after all, it is, the gender power hierarchy is reproduced within families, right? And that cultural change is complicated and sensitive, and sometimes it's not clear that the state is the best way of producing it. It has to be done in civil society, in social reforms. But there is no question, right, that the 21st century race will be won by countries that actually deal with the challenge of gender equality much more robustly. And the disability story is, I mean, is equally true, which is, look, it's the duty of every government and every society to say, we want to put every one of our citizens to be able to participate in the economy, right? Sometimes they'll have to do it differently, sometimes there'll have to be special provisions made. But I mean, Sri Lanka has a much better record than India, so we are the last people to be able to kind of saying, sort of any, anything on this, right? But the demand for greater and greater inclusion is a central fact of the 21st century, and governments have to respond to that.
Right. Of course, I think also I'm a huge advocate as well in terms of equal pay to equal work sort of thing. I think excluding the on your gender is a huge I mean, it's a huge problem for the economy. I mean, it's we're wasting our resources as well. So, Professor, on a final note, Professor, in your view, what in terms of policy making and in terms of developing socio-economic, in terms of socio-economic aspects, where do you think Sri Lanka should be looking at, in your opinion, if we and what more can be done is what I wanted to push to you.
So I think just a couple of quick things, right? One, I think fundamentally, it's my belief that Sri Lanka used to be a shining example in South Asia. And as I said, on a variety of social and human indicators, did much better in India, right? I think the core question all of our societies need to ask is, what are the basic terms of the social contract we want to live by? And do you want those construct the terms of that social contract in ways that are inclusive, first of all, because inclusion is a central element of economic growth, right? Without inclusion, you don't have stability. Without inclusion, you actually don't have participation and growth. Sri Lanka can be, it's our belief, we are looking to Sri Lanka to be a model of a open society that is inclusive, right, and has all the dynamism to meet the challenges of a market economy, right? And I think one of the things that happens is, our states often don't trust our people as much. I mean, there's so much ingenuity, right? But we kind of dissipate that ingenuity in all kinds of side alleys. All the state needs to do is say, look, we will provide the basic means that allow people to participate in the economy, health, education, and so forth, right? And then trust the ingenuity of the people, not box them in, right, by sort of contrived and imagined fears over and over again. And by the way, I'm saying this even more for India than for Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much, Professor Mehta. It was lovely having you today, and thank you so much for taking the time to see us. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and hope to see you all next week. Have a very good day. Bye-bye.